So I was going to go through a couple of the challenges that I saw as a Muslim college student. Specifically, they're all sort of theoretical, so just bear with me. And then I think Abrar and Imam are going to go through some of the more practical ones. Mine specifically, I'm going to focus on three areas. There's the intellectual, the cultural, and the epistemological. And I'll define what those mean. The first one I'm going to start with is the cultural. And I'm going to piggyback it off of a story from the Prophet ﷺ when he was in, I forget he was in Mecca and Medina, but there was a moment when he was sitting and he walked in, well, he walked in on Omar ibn Khattab while he was eating. And when Omar ibn Khattab was eating, he was eating like a lizard, and he offered it to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, I don't really eat that, in a way. I'm paraphrasing. And so Omar ibn Khattab was, like, all of a sudden he was taken aback because he thought he was doing something wrong, maybe he shouldn't be eating that. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ, am I eating something wrong? Should I not be eating this? Am I eating something haram? And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, it's not for my culture to eat the lizard. Meaning that it was like a personal preference. And this, I want to use this as a diving board in a way to go through the cultural challenges of Islam, just really quickly hit on them. It's very difficult, I feel, for myself, as I've grown up, and some of the people that I've encountered and talked to, where you don't see how to have your own personality and how to be Muslim because of the rhetoric and the sort of stigma that is presented of being a Muslim, where there is certain characters such as, trustworthy, honesty, these certain characters that are taught to you in the works of like Ghazali and other people who they teach you character and they teach you how to be a better Muslim. And they teach you how to become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's nothing in the Islamic discourse that differentiates like why me and Naeem study different things, or why we have different personalities. And sometimes it's really, really hard for me personally, when you're trying to find how your personality interacts with Islam. Because there are certain places, such as with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, where it says like, he didn't laugh very loud. When he laughed like at a very normal, at a very contained sort of manner. So he didn't go ha 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 like very loudly. And a lot of times that has to do with personality. And sometimes it seems like your personality and who you are and your preferences, say if you like dramatic movies as opposed to romance movies or comedy, how does that interact with Islam? How do you find your own place within the Islamic spectrum? Whereas there's no sort of rhetoric, there's no sort of established principles to teach you how to define your personality, as opposed to just growth in character. And in the cultural landscape, Dr. Jackson gave this really good example, Dr. Sherman Jackson, that I really liked, where he says a lot of Islam sometimes is black boxed from the Middle East. Black boxing is a metaphor where it's an engineering metaphor, where there used to be like in panels, if there's something wrong with like your paneling, you would have to search individually for the problem and have to find it and fix it. And then later on, I think in the 90s, they developed black box technology, which was if you were in like a system of electrical panels, there was boxed sets. So if there's something wrong with that box, you can take out the whole box and replace it with another box, as opposed to having to find the single cord or single thing that was wrong with it. And he used that to mention the fact that with Islam, a lot of it has been black boxed from the Middle East, which picks up the cultural and intellectual and social realities of the Middle East and puts it into America. And that doesn't work, because what you get then is you see things like, if you were to ask about how to navigate the sort of landscape of pop culture in America, it's like everything is haram. MTV, music, the entire genre of music, the entire genre of I don't know, poetry or art or whatever it is, the social life and social media, Facebook is haram. And because you've taken an entire cultural landscape and put it into another cultural landscape which doesn't exist, and I think as a Muslim college student it becomes very, very hard to navigate that landscape of being an American and being a Muslim at the same time, and because being American is not haram. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, it was like a process to figure out that it's not wrong to be an American, and that there are certain things that you don't have to wear a thobe every day. You don't have to have like a huge beard. Well, beard is different because there's a fiqh discussion on beard, but it's the way that people dress. You don't have to you don't have to have like specifically Middle Eastern clothing, and this is a problem in the culture and the landscape and how you negotiate pop culture. Is that we've all grown up in pop culture, and it's hard to understand as a Muslim when you're growing up how that relates to Islam and your own personality. So that's the cultural. In the intellectual, my problem when I went through school, and I'll make this short, was just that everything became relative at some point. Because I majored in religious studies, with a double major in English, and that was basically like here's what this person says, here's what that person says, here's what that person says, here's what that person says. And it's taught in a sort of postmodern culture, meaning that in postmodernity there's this belief that there's no truth, and the only truth is that there is no truth. So it's like a paradox. How can there be no truth? That no truth itself is the principle of truth. And so you're taught that in a way where you see, even within the Muslims, it's like, this Muslim believes this, that, this Muslim is very different from that Muslim is very different from that, and they're all scholars. And it's like, how do I begin to navigate any of these people with what I am? And I still, have existential sort of moves and other things like that. And the other big one is that Islam that's been black boxed from the Middle East hasn't gone through existentialism. And this is one of my big things that I'm trying to study, is that the Islam that we've been taught is a very fiqhi, sort of strict Sharia discourse, where it's everything's right, yes or no, right and wrong, black and white. Whereas in the West, when we've grown up, everything is very existentially based. Meaning that everything is about, what is my life about? Why am I doing this? I don't feel like getting out of bed today. I don't care about this. These are more very existential languages and very existential questions that we've grown up with. But Islam has no real rhetoric within it that addresses growing up in an existential society, where it's like, a lot of this very skeptical, like how many of you have a Tumblr, Virginia? Like if you have a Tumblr, this whole like, what is life, sort of, it's not really addressing Islam. That's sort of a really pop cultural sort of way of living. And it's hard to negotiate yourself with at the same time when you go to, it's like when you go to an Islamic discourse, it's like you have to leave that part of your personality alone, and then you have to like get Quran, get Hadith, and then go back to your normal life. And then it's hard to negotiate those two different things. And the last one is the work of ideology that Dr. Brown was saying, and specifically in epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how you learn things. And I know as a college student, if you study sciences, for instance, your entire system of belief is sort of, degraded in a way, because in the sciences everything is very practical, measurable, attainable, and visible. And with Islam, most of that is very internal. And it's hard to, all of a sudden, your religion sort of becomes sort of irrelevant in a way, because it's not something that can be shown or proven. And with the epistemology, a lot of times it becomes hard because you don't really, your world sort of changes. And most of us are trained within a Western epistemology, such as where we take things in religion, such as the hijab, or with prayer, or with hadith. And we'll say things like, I don't really believe in the hijab, or I don't really believe in hadith, is because we've been trained through a Western philosophical standpoint. And it's hard to negotiate that where you are the center of your own universe, and take that with Islam, where it's like, no, you're not the center of the universe, you have to operate within a system that has not really about you. And it's hard to negotiate that, I think, within being a Muslim college student. And the last one, I think, is the work of ideology, which Dr. Brown mentioned. Ideology is really interesting. If you ever, I can give you guys some resources if you want some books and videos that are really, really interesting and discusses it. The cool thing about ideology is that it's, like if I give an example of what ideology does to you, it's like with a person who recycles, he or she will put in a bottle into the bin, and they'll feel really good about themselves. But in reality, they haven't really done anything. And that's the work of ideology, where in the background of your mind, as Dr. Brown was saying, you'll do things which you think are very, very right, especially within the Muslims who do things like they'll enforce people who, if you come to the pray at the Muslim prayer space sometimes, if someone sees you and you're not wearing a hijab, or your hands are below your ankles, they'll be like, you can't pray, you can't do that, because they're operating on principles of ideology, but they don't really understand why those principles are there, or why the undercurrents of those principles. And a lot of that, my question is, then how do you start to form an American identity within an epistemologically and culturally flawed sort of understanding of America? Because it's like sometimes when you try to study Islam, or you try to become a better Muslim, it's like you have to leave your American identity behind and become a better Muslim. And it's how do you start to negotiate that space? And how do you understand the work of ideology, where it's like, with the example of recycling, it's not about you throwing the bottle away. It's about, the world becoming a better, saving the world from an ecological standpoint. And how do you negotiate those spaces? So these are some of the works that I thought, some of the things that I came across.